want to start by acknowledging we are in Miami. We are about 10 miles from a Tequesta mound, a sacred mound. So I do want to do a land acknowledgement that we are here on indigenous land, and we'll talk about that later also. And as most of you know, this exhibit here is a lot of artists and designers, sustainable designers, who have made these incredible pieces out of all sorts of materials. I don't know if you guys know, but there's one made out of condoms, there's film, there's recycled natural dyes. Anyway, we're gonna get into that, and we have one of the artists who made one of the pieces, which is around the corner, and this is Aurora, and I will let her introduce herself in a minute, but she is one of the designers. She's also I consider her an activist. I followed her work forever. I'm so excited that she's here. She has a show, by the way, at Bernice Diamond Gallery, and Bernice also curated the show, so afterwards I'll have her tell you where you can see her work right now live. I'm going to go on a first name basis now until they introduce themselves. This is Vero, another Vero, also from Ecuador. And Vero wrote a book in 2020 about the natural dyes, indigenous dyes of Ecuador. And I worked with her many times. She's so knowledgeable about how to take a material and dye it naturally. And she's also a teacher of textiles at the Marangoni Institute. And she's also a former or current sustainable designer herself. This is Pamela, Dr. Pam. She is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Miami. She is another person that I have wanted to have on a panel for years. She specializes, I don't know if you specialize in it, but she is, I consider, one of the foremost authorities in the city on plastic. And I just read one of her papers. She is incredibly brilliant, and I'm so excited to have her here because I think she brings something to this conversation, which is the more academic, scientific part. And I think that always this interdisciplinary conversation is what really creates awareness and change. And last but not least, we have David, whose exhibit is next door. You may know him by his other name, which I will let him tell you all about. And you may have seen his graffitis all over Miami. He is also an artist who I consider an activist, who has a social practice that is so recognizable and iconic to everyone in Miami, including my teenage daughter, who everyone in Miami, if you've been here long enough, you have seen his work. So right now I'm going to have everyone, they're probably going to kill me, but I'm going to make them introduce themselves in a short little introduction, first and last name, and how you can get a hold of them on social media. I'll start with you, David.
Yeah, my artist name is A-Holes, that's blue, and you can find me everywhere. Yeah, I paint on stuff, paint on trash, paint on walls, draw, and I'm here, I'm happy to be here.
I'm Pamela L. I'm trying to stay away from social media. It's so toxic. If you want to reach out to me, you can email me at pp@yahoo.edu. But I do have Instagram account, which is Plastics as Material Culture.
Hi everyone, my name is Veronica Buitrón, and you can find me on Instagram as @Veronica Buitrón, Buitron.
I'm trying to remember my Instagram.
Aurora Molina, fiber artist.
My name is Aurora, and it's Aurora Molina Fiber Art. But the charm is at my studio. If you want to see kids' work, brilliant kids' work, it's Play Studio Artelier. And that makes me more proud than my own Instagram.
Okay, so anyway, let's start. And I want to start with some awful statistics to counterbalance the amazing creativity. 66% of unwanted clothing ends up in a landfill. So oftentimes the narrative on sustainable fashion is recycle, donate, but the reality is that most of that ends up in a landfill. In these landfills, 65% of the clothing is synthetic plastic based, which means it is not decomposing. It is going to sit there for thousands of years, and you can this more, right? 15% of it is actually recycled, and another 19% is burned. So that's the reality of what happens with all the waste and the garbage and the trash that we're consuming. We now own 60% more clothing than we did 15 years ago. And because of the rise of social media and something called the haul, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but Shein, which is a Chinese fast fashion company, which in the last 10 years has completely changed everything, the business, the narrative of fashion. They are now in the top 4 most polluting companies, right along with like Exxon and Coca-Cola, which is quite a feat for a 10-year-old company. Anyway, on social media, they have something called #Shein where young influencers and teenagers go and buy Shein products, dump them on the floor, and post them on social media. So that's where the name of this panel comes from. We're the anti-haul. Like, how do we bring the conversation of clothing, of textiles, into something more regenerative and nurturing as opposed to polluting and toxic? Fashion, which is seemingly a very superficial thing, is actually a microcosm of the world economy. It deals with plastic, it deals with supply chains, it deals with everything. Transportation, every aspect of the world economy, agriculture, labor, human rights abuses, whatever you want, it's all in fashion. But however, fashion, as we know it, the word fashion was not used really until about 1860 or 1870. A sociologist named George Schimmel first published something about fashion, or fashion. It comes from the French, the way, the manner, and he was a sociologist, coining and talking about fashion as something which is the manner of the elites. From the very beginning, it was used to demarcate us and them, what the elites were wearing and what other people wanted to wear. So there was already this very colonial European. Now, when I say fashion, most people think Paris, London, New York, and certainly there are very creative, incredible things coming out of those places. But in the past 10 years, the discourse of fashion has shifted to seeing fashion as something that's not just Western. And there are places and centers such as in Nigeria, in Buenos Aires, all over the world that have fashion. If you think about it, human beings have worn clothing from the time, from always, right? Fashion is just clothing systems, and clothing systems are universal, which means that when we talk about fashion, we have to take into consideration fashion systems from other places. But I'm digressing a little bit. So now I want to start with a term called waste colonialism. Waste colonialism is a term coined in 1989 to talk about what happens when these excess fabrics, what happens with these excess fabrics. I told you that about 60% ends up in landfills. Those landfills are mainly in Africa and in Chile. So the biggest secondhand market is in Ghana. And it's called the Guantanamo. Oh God, I'm probably butchering that. And 15 million garments a day are shipped to Ghana. So if you think about it, it's a crazy resource, most of the natural resources are taken from the global south, sold in Western countries, and then the trash, the refuse, is shipped right back. So this idea of trash is a huge thing for me, and it's something that I think gets swept under the rug when people talk about sustainable fashion. They want to keep the narrative, as shiny as possible and really hide these ugly facts. So with this, I am going to start with Pam Geller, and I want to talk about this idea of microplastics and plastics in general in our society.
Okay. Well, I was thinking about your saying about landfills. So basically, archaeological research that was conducted in the 70s and 80s by a guy named William Jack. He decided to start excavating landfills, and so he did fresh pits, which was in Staten Island. And what his research showed was that nothing decomposes. even organic materials. So landfills, nothing. We found like hot dogs that were and so plastics in them are not. So it's actually a good thing because that means things aren't leaching into the environment. It's a closed space. But the problem is when plastics gets out there, and that's where we're at today. So it gets out there, like with fashion in particular. Anytime we put stuff in a dryer, it's in the air, it's in our water, it's terrestrial. Plastic doesn't degrade in the same way that any other substance. I mean, as an archaeologist, I'm fascinated by the kinds of materials that we use, whether it's pottery, stone, glass. Like plastics is different because everything else will naturally biodegrade. Plastics photodegrade, so when it's not in the landfill and it's out in space, it just gets into smaller and smaller and smaller particles, whether it's there's scale, macro, micro, and nano. And so now, because it's ubiquitous in pretty much every ecosystem, it's things that we've all taken in. So I think the statistic, to ground it, because the numbers are kind of mind-boggling, is that we actually eat everyone a credit card's worth of plastic a year. And there's like an interesting irony there, because the idea, because it all tracks to these kinds of insane fast capitalism that is what is the umbrella under which fast fashion is situated.
So, and actually, I was thinking about you because I was thinking about Shin, about the amount of, I think they have over 600,000 items on their website every day. It's a lot of photos. And they're now using AI to quickly, they can turn around a product in 3 days. In 3 days, somebody can post something on social media. In 3 days, they have captured it, done it, and it's going out. And when I was thinking about the textile waste, and then I thought, plastic bags. And my daughter will tell you, like, my kids have to hide those bags in my house. I don't want, like, everything is shipped in plastic. And I know you wrote an article about the Amazon.
I had a piece appear in the New York Times, I think, right during the pandemic, about Amazon, because the numbers have got so exacerbated during the pandemic because we were all home doing nothing but ordering from Amazon. And so it was to try and hold Amazon accountable for their packaging at the very least. Someone in the comments in the New York Times told me I was an apologist for capitalism, which made me sad. But Amazon is particularly egregious because they are a global corporation, and from the things that they sell, because they obviously sell a lot of fashion that is made out of plastic, from the way that they ship it, and in trying to see what the changes that they've made, like the sustainability officer at Amazon's got in touch with me, and they greenwash. But I think most corporations greenwash. There are very few that I can think of, maybe Legos, or like Nike. Every massive corporation that deals with plastics in some capacity has a sustainability page now. And if you look at the discourse that's on it, they say a lot of great things, but there's not any kinds of larger structural institutional changes.
And that's another thing that is part of this conversation is the systemic, right? And this term greenwashing came into play in the 70s. It was originally directed to the petroleum company that started producing these ads, and you can Google them and be like, where they start, where they show like animals, in the wild, and it's Chevron talking about how environmental they are. I mean, it was just insane in the 70s. There was just zero regulation. So greenwashing is basically when all of these corporations use something to pretend that they care about the environment, when the reality is all they care about are their profits. Anyway, now we're going to talk about something a lot more fun, which is David's work, which I think deals with trash. And if you haven't seen his work next door, there's an exhibit. And he also, the exhibit next door is called Geographies of Trash. It's done in conjunction with FIU. And in my view, it is this like incredibly social, like performative, but in a good way. You're going to tell more about it, but it's really an incredible project. And next door, you can see it, but I'm going to let you describe it.
Yeah, thanks. I like painting on stuff, so I got really into riding the bike and getting out on the bike, seeing a bunch of different places. It's a lot easier to navigate, and I just saw a bunch of trash like while I was riding, and I know that there's a lot of people that follow my stuff and they're fans of what I do. So in my mind, I was like, I'll paint these trash pieces. Worst case scenario, it's something that people could see. It's like a low risk target. type of stuff, and I could do it on the bike. But we basically gamified the whole process. It was during the whole NFT hype of things that were happening, but we were actually using the blockchain to archive the pieces and to give people like verification of the trash. So it is trash at the end of the day. We just, we're doing it, we call it art, and we're trying to elevate the trash pieces and also democratize art collecting and treat people that are actually going out there picking up trash that should be picked up or shouldn't be there in the first place. We're incentivizing them, and we're bringing them along for the ride. And every piece that's next door was borrowed from the community, so nothing was made new for it. It was a submission process. So I painted like over 3,000 pieces like within the last 3 years, or maybe a little bit more. Done 12,600 miles on the bike, but we've minted like 1,200 NFTs. Our community is like 2,000 something people. But it's just having fun, like with trash. It's out there. It's stuff that shouldn't be out there to begin with, and I'm just going around and intervening with it on the spot, getting my bike ride in. That's how I got sober and I keep my mind right. And so if on that process I could get people something that's limited, keep them engaged, get them outside of their crib, and enjoy the city, whether it's on a bike or whatever, like it's just what I'm doing. And FIU, they brought me on a Radcliffe, so it was incubated through there, so it was a way of like strategizing this little ecosystem that like I'm getting a currency of me being able to ride the bike. The people are getting something that's original and they can trade it, sell it, do whatever they want, and everybody's happy. It just keeps it going, and yeah, so it's pretty much like you can see like the whole thing next door. Like,
yeah, definitely check it out. And I love this idea of disrupting, which is sort of the idea of the show, and I think everyone here in different ways is this idea of disrupting these large systems. And like I said, fashion is a microcosm of the global economic system and everything that is wrong with it. So I had a nice connection with something that you said with your practice, Aurora, and I want you to tell us about the show that you have up, because what you were saying, a lot of the stuff that you think, I'm sure, is like has to do with like the construction industry, right?
it's every type of thing.
Every type of thing, right? Right. But I know anyone who's lived in Miami has noticed that there has been, I know I've had my tire popped many times, the amount of construction and gentrification that we have in Miami, right? And so I think that's something that your latest show addresses. So can you tell us about that?
Yes. I have lots of things to say about that. But first I want to acknowledge my former professor, Jacek, there. There is someone that has to take the fall for creating artists, and I think he's one of them. The show that I have now, it's called Aurora Molina's Neighborhood. I did not want my name on it, but Bernice insisted, which puts me in the spot where I live, which is in the Gables. So what happened within the last year or so, I started feeling that I was crunched in a city that I lived in for 23 years. So there's development happen a block away from me where I live, in front of me where I have the studio, behind me where I have the studio next to me. So I started to feel like the bulldozer can knock on the door in a second. Just going around the block, walking around with my daughter, I started to noticing that this was coming. I started to notice the eviction notes on the doors of the buildings. These are mid-century buildings that started to just get everyone evicted because they were selling out, different landlords, they were selling out of the properties to one specific developer to create a bigger project in the city, claiming that it was sort of like a Mediterranean style villa kind of thing, where the apartments start at 1.5 million, and since everyone can afford it, why not, right? We displaced 360 people for 58 to have their apartments in there. And I am up for development. I'd love to see streets paved, biking lanes, entrances, and build that development in a city that's conscious about their citizens. But this is much more than that. I have the Lowe's that started and just grew during the pandemic right behind my studio. And I started to think about where, these was coming to me, where I had to then move space and move like this livelihood that I had created there, and where I had to sort of like, moved into the city. So as an artist, I think these are things that you kind of like raise the question and then you start thinking, okay, what can I say? What can I do from where I stand? And I knew I was having a solo show, and we sat together with Bernice. I always like to brainstorm some of my concerns, and she said, baby, you just have to do it now. And I said, but I don't want to be a persona non grata where I live. Like, I don't want anyone knocking on my door. She said, you have to do it now, and this is when the story has to be told. So these are photographs of the whole process, from where the buildings were still standing to how they've been demolished. In all that sector in the area, which is between Santander Avenue and Ponce de Leon, like that circle in there. I've never seen anything like that in the 23 years that I've been in the city. So these are images that I capture right over the fence. I mean, there's not much composition or anything. I just wanted the graphics. And in my work, I always based it on photography, but it's mostly figurative, always like people's stories and things like that, but these needed to be sort of like the DNA that got imprinted in the buildings and the stories of the people that had to leave. So there was sort of like still this reminiscence of the social aspect and the construction of those stories that had to be removed. So the show is out now. We had the opening last week. The gallery works by appointment, so if you're interested, you can call the gallery, and she opens Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays, like business hours. We're gonna have a couple of openings here and there to activate the show, so you're more than welcome to stop by and see how Greg is looking now.
Thank you. And so Aurora is a fiber artist, which means she mainly works with textiles, embroidery, and that brings me to another part of the conversation that is very dear to my heart, because I've worked actually with global artisans for over 20 years. I'm old, 25. And that is something that I share with Vero, and that is something that, again, in the sustainable fashion narrative, which is very whitewashed to like, hey, let's recycle, and it's all good. You can keep buying crap, just donate it. And I just told you what happens with the donated clothes. Something that is left out of the conversation often, because the conversation tends to be about the human rights abuses in the garment factories in Asia, which is horrendous, and has every right to be in the conversation. But something that's not talked about often is the artisan labor, which the craft artisan economy is second to agriculture as the world's leading employer. So agriculture is about 40% in the developing world. The craft economy is second. The craft economy is mainly made up of women. A lot of them work at home. It's a way for women to be at home, care for the elderly. And so it is a very forgotten, less funded part of the global economy. And yet it is a huge sector for growth. And it's something that is also idealized. And if you follow fashion, there's oftentimes something called cultural appropriation, where brands will come and they'll take an embroidery and they'll send it to China, and they'll, and then someone's like, hey, that's actually from Oaxaca, and you should be thanking the Oaxaca. Anyway, it's a whole thing. But I want to ask Vero, because she is someone who, I want to talk to her about two things. One is the working with artisans, global artisans. And the other thing is talking about how, she's also from Ecuador, that's where I'm from, how the way fashion and clothing is consumed now, AKA the Shein Mall, versus what happened with many of our grandparents. A lot of us are Latin American, maybe our abuelitos had a different way of consuming and caring for clothing, so that's what I want you to talk to us about, Vero.
Okay, so, but I have questions that are related to what you asked me. Okay. So my first thought is artisans have to compete with the fashion system, which is so unfair. Because what they do is done in a slow time pace, right? All of the materials that they have to gather have to be local because that's what they can access. It's not that they can call a supplier in China and tell them, oh, what do you have, blah, blah, blah. I can buy these high minimums and produce some, right? So they have to create something from what they have nearby and then put prices similar to what Shein is pricing. And it's just so unsustainable, right? And that's why it's disappearing. They cannot keep with their craft, and they cannot pass it to the younger generations because basically it's not profitable. They're not going to survive, right? And we can be, the designers working with artisans can be trying to help, like do something, get involved with these other ways of creating goods, but we also have to enter the fashion system that is really savage, right? So that's my experience with working with artisans, that you are a small designer working with a small group of people. You need to, in a way, create something out of nothing, basically. And then you go out to the world, which is basically the Western world, the Western fashion system, and no one is actually wanting to pay the real price because we are considering artisan goods as fashion, and they are not exactly fashion. And I wanted to ask you, when was trash invented? Like, the word trash.
The word trash. The word trash, trash is, I mean, part of being human, and always has been. So, there's always been discipline. I don't know about the actual word trash. But the minute humans started living in proximity to each other, they then needed to figure out how to do a waste disposal that would be away from where people were occupying or living. Because with trash comes disease and pestilence, and I mean, I think we're kind of not too, we're very sanitized. We smells bother us. I don't think that's a recent phenomenon. But trash but that's what archaeologists study. They study all the stuff that everyone left behind.
Yeah. And I remember I was in an artisan community in Ecuador, and they're not like what we have in our minds as like a beautiful place in a farm in the Andes, super clean. It's pretty dusty and like it's not, I don't know, like the nicest art, let's say. And I remember that I asked them like, why don't you pick up the candy envelope? And they're like, I'm like, that's trash. And they're like, but isn't it like a banana peel that it just disappears? So and I was like, oh, they don't see it as not disappearing. Like they think in their natural, like like where they live, most of the stuff is like produce, fresh produce that will disappear. And that caught my attention.
Well, I mean, there's something cultural about what we define as trash. I mean, to your point, that I think there's a fine line between art and trash, right?
I feel that, technically if something's trash and somebody decides to call it art, that's like cleaning up the mess, just like a verb, or like just reassigning the name of it. But I think that calling something, like painting on something and inventing on it and just redefining what it was used for, I think that's another way. I just think there's a bunch of different ways to look at things from a different perspective, an open mind, not just like, not even just painting on it, just like getting active and picking it up or disposing of things in the right way. And I think it's just...
Or reusing.
Yeah, reusing would be the ideal thing, I would think, but I think that there's always a better option, even amongst like bad options. So I feel that like we just take it for granted that it's like, all right, we got something big, we don't have time to go to landfill, dump it on the street. So like I think we've gotten used to seeing stuff like that, at least out here.
When I think of trash, though, I know that the literature has talked about it in terms of disease. There's a sacred polluting component to it. And so sometimes trash is associated with things that are like a public health concern. Right? You sent me a pic about the condom dress.
Oh,
It's like, I mean, with the plastics.
Did everyone see that? Condom dress.
With plastics, I'm ambivalent. Like most of it we don't need, right? We don't need it in our clothing, we don't need it in our bags. But the stuff that I've written on talks about these kinds of things that are biopolitical, that we do need them. Like condoms make us safer from sexually transmitted diseases. Disposable masks, which have plastic in them, make us safer, right? Like the kinds of like syringes that we get vaccines in, all of these things. So I'm ambivalent to a certain extent about some of the plastics that we might actually need because they do help us navigate a very fraught world, right? But most of it, I think, that is stuff that the single-use disposable stuff that speaks to conspicuous consumption, or planned obsolescence, or these concepts that we just kind of discard and don't think about. I think it's very problematic.
There's a guy named Jay Critchley in Providence who, back in the 80s, collected 30,000 plastic tampon applicators from the beach near the Boston shore. He sewed them to make clothing that was statement. So the first thing he made was the robes of the Statue of Liberty, which he put on, stood on a pedestal in the Art Museum, holding up a torch made tampon applicators with a crown.
What was his name?
Jay Critchley.
Cool. Oh, and I wanted to answer the question about our abuelitos. And we were talking about this before. Like, I come from Ecuador. I moved here 7 years ago. And I lived all other places, but I was raised in Ecuador. And how we see clothing there is different. It's similar but different from here. So I remember going to this like local brand. It's like the Gap of Ecuador. It's called Pinto, yeah? And Pinto used to make awesome like basics. And they last so long. I still have one t-shirt. It's like 20 years old. And that t-shirt looks better than some of the t-shirts I have bought for my son that have 3 washes. Right? So in Ecuador, we were used to having like local companies that are now disappearing, and they had better quality. I don't know if that happened here too, but when the t-shirt was old, it became the pajama. And then after being pajama, it was for cleaning for typing things, un trapito, yeah. And then you maybe like throw it away, or you skip the part of the trapito and like you don't need it to someone who needs, like, it has a longer life cycle. And my grandparents was the same situation, like clothing was more valuable. My mom didn't like it. Like you as a younger generation might see it as, oh, I am poor, that's why I have to inherit this, and I don't want to inherit anything. I want to buy all the clothing that I want, right? And that's also that, like, I don't know how to call it, but like, let's call it, I don't know, trauma, okay? It's not, so my mom came from my poor grandparents, or like, and she started having a business during the oil boom in Ecuador. So everyone started having more access to things, and she could now buy more clothes. And she started having plastic bags for going to the grocery shop. Like, all of a sudden, you have this plastic culture. And now she's like, oh, this looks old, you have to throw it away. I'm like, no. It's like an obsession to show that we have surpassed that moment of austeridad, like of absence. But on the other hand, it was a better approach what my grandma did, like, creating her own clothes. She used to have my grandpa's suits and like open them and twist them. Use the other side of the fabric and resew. That's called virar eterno. That's how they call it. And I think like now, like our younger generation, our generation should find like an in-between. Like I understand that maybe this is too much, virar eterno is like an exaggeration, but the other thing is also wrong.
Yes.
So yeah.
And there's actually a huge, because Gen Z is some of the most environmentally conscious generations. I mean, just speaking of fashion, New York Fashion Week was in mid-September. There were 70,000 protesters disrupting the fashion shows. That's a big number, you know. And you see these activist groups, and if you want to know which ones to follow, you can ask me later. And you know, they are causing ripples. But at the same time, you know, at the same time, there is a consumer demand for these, you know, for the atrocious rate of production and consumption. So it's a real, you know, and I think social media, I think there's just so many conversations to have on why. And why is this consumer so aware, but at the same time, so hooked on the new? And this idea of fashion as, you know, there's a definition taught at schools, you know, fashion is something new, the trends, you know, it's all about that. And that definition it's so wrong, because it only, you know, it's a very Western idea of progress versus this idea of craft, of artisan, which is about tradition and care. And there's a great article which I sent to you, which I'm happy to, if you find me later, I'll give you a name, it's the new designer. His name is Peter Doe. He's Vietnamese American. He's the new designer for Helmut Lang. Anyone who was in the 90s knows him. And he talks about this with Ocean Bong, who's a writer, about the culture of his grandparents, his culture of care, of tailoring, of mending, of sewing. And it's a really beautiful conversation, and it's, you know, very much in contrast. Anyway, I don't know what time it is, but I want to open the floor up to questions so you guys can ask these incredible people some questions. So if anyone has a question, let me know. Anyone?
There's something I wanted to mention during the pandemic. There was a very interesting set of conversations online in Zoom, of course, and Stella McCartney showed up to be a very, you know, interested activist in this whole fashion thing. And the proposal she was making at that time was like to lock the seasons in fashion to 2 instead of 4, and things like, you know, actual decisions that would have changed the world nicely and in a big way. But you know, once the pandemics went away, the lockdown, like everybody was desperately going back to normal, and all of those ideas went down the
Well,
drain.
the fashion world, it used to be spring, and then, you know, 2 seasons, right? Then resort was invented, right? So then there were 3. Then I think it went to like 5. Zara and Shein Zara has 52 to 54. They have dropped something every 2 weeks. Shein drops something every 3 days. So this acceleration is insane. And yes, during the pandemic, a lot of designers said, wow, we need a break. Because they burn out, and they, you know, it's very unhealthy on a mental health to constantly churn new stuff. And it is true, a lot of people in the industry thought, oh, finally, you know, it's the pandemic, we can slow down. But it has actually gone back. And another thing, that during the pandemic, they stopped traveling. So before, the fashion world would move, you know, oh, now it's the Paris fashion season. And you had all the fashion people going to Paris, you know, in the private planes, and, you know, think about the carbon emissions. And then that stopped. Now it's even more. So sadly, it's gone back to not just pre-pandemic levels, but it's accelerated once again. Yeah.
I wanted to say something about the pandemic, though. I found myself doing a lot more classes online and doing teacher developments for teachers in the school system, because all of a sudden there was this need of like going home and finding what was there, because the rest wasn't available. Like, you couldn't go to the store, you know. So I think now we're in that transition where we still think that, you know, this movement of craftivism is bringing a lot of things that make people be more mindful of recycling and going and putting that that to use or donate it. I'm a dumpster for donations at the studio. There's a point that I can't receive anymore because all of a sudden, like, people start to look for artists instead of like just, you know, putting things to the trash. It's like someone can use these, like students can use these. So I think it opened up, because we had to look indoors, it opened up more so than before to people that started to think these could be used. And this show here, one of the purposes of the show was to have artists work with materials that, you know, you didn't have to buy, you could recycle, like, you know, these two pieces here that are plastic bags or tapes. So art is a great example of using this industry and giving new life and new meaning to it. And I think that happened during the pandemic because we were just trapped. For more than we love Stella McCartney, it's like how many people can afford her? Her sustainability. And like, I love it, but how many people?
And by the way, she is owned by LVMH. I'm pretty sure LVMH, Bernardo, richest person in the world, largest conglomerate, a lot of greenwashing. Even though she is amazing.
So you end up having brands like Shein and Sarah, but because it's you know, the period and end of the stories, they just are more affordable. And when you look at your pocket, that's where the conversation ends. So for more than you wanted to, you know, do these for the better of the world, you end up where your pocket can reach. So it's like, my question would be, what system should we implement that make long-lasting pieces? And I think as a fiber artist, I can tell you, like, I put my money where I cherish the memories in like the weeklies, you know, which are passed on generation to generation. So if you're holding up something that's valuable to you, it might not be fashionable, have like a great branding, but if you're, you know, if you're just in love with that piece, then you don't have to continue to buy new pieces, and it just makes it, which comes to the abuelitas, you know,
Yeah.
it's like where that love is to the garment, which becomes textile derives from tetsere, which is language, it's text. So it's another form of language that we wear to express ourselves. So if that is embedded in the garment and in the craft of the artisans, you just wouldn't have to buy one every 2 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we were talking about. It's that culture of care and really of love versus the haul thing, which is a very addictive, right? It's like a dopamine hit. Like, oh, I saw, you know, what's her face? One of the card, I don't know, I can't tell the difference. She's wearing that thing, you know, and then she'll copy it, and then, you know, it's this trend of this thing, then and it's just this constant churning of social media, you know, which really activates that addictive gene in people's head that they have to have it. And I mean, that's the whole idea of trend is based on this, which is the exact opposite of, you know, what we're talking about.
But also, like, here I've heard this term, shopping therapy. Yes. And I think of the article that you sent me too. Like, here our approach to shopping is basically going to the mall or a street that has stores, and you see the final garment there. You like it, you can afford it, you get it. That's the approach we have to clothes, right? And in the article you showed me, he says that how Peter though in Vietnam, he could see how the material was done close to him. And when you have that, you appreciate the material. You see all the process, and it has more value. But here we don't have it. Here all the systems are overseas. China, Bangladesh, Pakistan, we don't see the process anymore. We don't have, I don't know, like in Ecuador, you can see sheep and you can see artisans in the street spinning, and you wonder, but here we don't have that much. So we have lost also the sense of where things come from. We don't care. We just want I like it, I can afford it, I buy it. That's it.
I had a question for Pam. Out of all plastics you research, like, it can be very overwhelming
eco anxiety now from doing research on plastics.
Oh, I'm sure. What has been kind of the most effective steps people take? Like, is it the clothing? Is it the cups? Is it the...
I mean, as far as what item in particular, or just how you even deal with the problem on the scale of something like plastics? Because I've been listening to everything that everyone's saying, and I mean, there's so many moving parts in it that to deal with, because plastics is a global warming, it's a climate change issue, right? Without a doubt, and it's something that's so big and overwhelming and beyond us, that in order to actually move a needle, I think that you do need grassroots things. I really do. I think you do need a culture of care. But I think that aside from that bottom up, you actually need top down. You need corporate responsibility. You need legislation that gets put in place that holds people accountable. You need to start shaming, because I keep thinking about like where's the kind of winter and all this. If she like said, screw 2 seasons, like let's just go sustainable, like she would move that needle because of the influence that she wields, but she's not doing that, right? Like, so I think that the grassroots stuff is incredibly important because it teaches us alternative ways to be human and to navigate the world. But you also need these larger forces to come into play, because at the end of the day, we can only do so much even as an individual. There has to be large-scale institutional, corporate, structural, legislative change. And all of that, I think, is what changes stuff.
Thank you.
I mean, by the way, like, it's France, like, banning single-use plastic. It's things like that.
So, I mean, it's kind of hard being in Miami where you're not ever going to get close to the means of production. I mean, you know, the factorias in Hialeah where all the grandmothers came from other countries to work in are probably mostly gone. So, I mean, what do we do on a practical level? It seems to me that we place value on, you know, the artisan's work. So maybe I suggest that somebody open a pop-up where David can come in and, you know, paint on, like, people's clothes that they don't have use for anymore, and then they receive a brand new value, and then that can be sold and used in that way. Because I feel like, yeah, I mean, sometimes, I mean, this dress is like 8 years old, you know? Sometimes I'm like, oh my God, I'm gonna wear this really old dress, and all these people are gonna be nicely dressed, and, you know, but it's like, how do we create a system, even like hyper-local, where the stuff that she's no longer going to wear for whatever reason receives some kind of value that takes it to this next level for the next person that comes along.
Yeah.
No.
I found a new job.
Those things sound really cool and awesome, but I think it just takes some organization, and on top of that, it has to be worth the people's while. Whether it's bringing in somebody that they're aware of who it is, like, you know, from making it just like a fad type of thing to be like, no, this is a collectible, this is happening, you're part of this other project. And I think that when things are organized that way, they can kind of appreciate that moment. Sometimes it'll also open up to people just going there to get stuff to flip it on eBay. So it's a caution type of thing of like, you know, just opening up the floodgates. But I mean, I'm with it. Anything that's cool, like, I'm always down with it.
It sounds like it's effective if you create community around it.
Yeah, I mean, if you make the people care about it, like how we were talking about that Walida way of doing things, you appreciate things differently when you look at things differently because of like necessity. We kind of have to. I think that what our goal is that by adding art to the trash, I mean, and this just using ours for an example, we remind the people that, all right, now you're part of this thing, and you're part of a bigger picture of stuff, whether, regardless of the piece that it is, you know, so you start thinking the same way, and now we do things to include those people. So you got somebody that's down with that way of thinking that aligns with the different types of things that we're pushing. Now we got a group of people that we can address other stuff, and we mobilize, and we incentivize their mobilization using either digital assets or just random stuff, but we're part of it, and we're not like showing people like, hey, we're just pushing you this way. It's like, no, you're gonna catch us there, we're gonna be part of this thing, and this is the way that we see it. But it takes like getting people on the same page, getting them hyped up about it, and like showing them that they're not weird for doing it, you know?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, Miami, we're in such a culturally diverse, I mean, until they kick us all out. In place, you know, we have, even Abuelitas, we have Haitian, I mean, I live over here now, and I mean, I see these, you know, I see these like pop-up Haitian markets all over the place, right? And the fact, and then it's amazing. So I agree, I mean, there should be it would be really cool to centralize it and have some sort of like, I don't know, that's something.
You know, there's another story, because you mentioned you're from Ecuador, right? So there's this dude around here, like, he drives people around, like, on Rash and whatever, he's a really cool dude. But there's a lot of Ecuadorian workers, like, doing the construction on the new buildings and everything. And they would always go shopping at a flea market, and he would take them to this particular flea market where they would get stuff. But then eventually the dude put them on to Target, they started going to Target. And then they, like, months later, they hated it because the Target stuff was falling apart, and they started going back to the flea market to go pick up stuff. So, I mean, I know it's like later on that we'll talk about it. Maybe it's relevant.
If I might add to that idea, there's an artist, a local artist, he started with me, and he has a new project that's, he's creating ropes. So he's going to have different drop-off points in the city for people to donate clothes, so he could turn that into ropes to create a sculpture. With that said, I think artists started now that these craftism celebrate in the boom, you start to think more creatively where fabric and textile has a part in it rather than, you know, painting, that you can add these recycled garments that they end up, you don't know where it brought it in the landfill. So when you have initiatives like that, it's where the two worlds starts to merge, you know, someone that started to be more conscious about being sustainable, giving it use, and our world that's opening up its door to something that before was kind of like, you know, like not accepted. So he got a grant for this purpose to activate different points in the city. And we could share with Kimberly when that's happening, because he wants to have it in, you know, spaces that bring artists and the community together. So.
That's a good idea. I think maybe later we should figure out a central place to dump all this. We've talked about a lot of stuff. I'm sure everyone wants to know what article are we talking about. What? Anyway, Isabel.
Is that what you had a question? Me? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I wanted to bring like what we were talking before, something to the conversation. It's about, at least for me, in fashion, it's all about materials. So we should like end the use of plastic and like try to look at nature and to do like long-lasting things, but also like as you have like trees, like very old trees in nature, you also have like herbs that grow every different season. So maybe we could like think about different life cycles of fashion and materials. Like you can buy like a t-shirt that you can like throw it into the compost bin, and like so that turns into earth or whatever, and then having like long-lasting things that you care of. So it's not, I mean, I'm very idealistic, but there are different ways of thinking about the timing and the time in fashion. I don't know, that's something I want to bring.
Yeah, the idea of circularity, I mean, there is, and I'm trying to remember, I've seen one really good documentary about just how that is, you know, I've seen very few successful full rounds where a product is actually, you know, it's got to be organic cotton, and make sure it's not like, you know, what the pesticides in it, and you know, and is the person paid fairly to do it, and then how is it made, and then does it have a synthetic dye, because then it can't go back to it is such a crazy, interesting thing, because then you realize all of these steps and all of the impediments, like synthetic dyes, like the use of polyester, that really make it hard when it should be easy, because cotton, hemp, and silk should be able, right, to just naturally decompose.
See, like the fallacy is that onus, we feel like that onus is on us to do something about that, and it shouldn't be. Like, it has to be on the corporations. If you put the onus on the corporations to be responsible for what they're producing and then what we're consuming and then what gets disposed, if you create a circular economy, then they recognize the challenges of doing that. But they're the ones who reap the benefits from it.
Yeah.
I think like Frederick Jameson is this guy who said, he's like, is it easier to envision the end of capitalism or the end of the world, right? And like most people you ask that question, but when I ask my students who are Generation Z, they're like, it's so much easier to envision the end of the world. But I would imagine that like at this stage, after that generation has been through so much, that's been totally traumatic. But the idea is that even if we have the end of the world, then we have the end of capitalism. So it benefits corporations to actually figure out how to do a circular economy at some point.
I think one advice, on the meantime, while we wait for the end of the world and how do you call it, public policy? Yeah, you can try to stop using polyester. That's, if you have polyester, don't wash it as often. If you wash it, use cold water. And then I think that's it. Like, don't wash it as often. Hang clothes instead of put it in the dryer. And as for hemp, linen, ramen, jute, all of these fibers are called bast fibers, and they grow at a faster rate, and they don't need herbicides and pesticides. They don't need irrigation water, so they are more efficient if you compare them with cotton. Cotton is super thirsty. It needs a bunch of pesticides, herbicides, and plus all this energy that you need to create this plant, only to be able to collect the fiber in the seed. So it's super, super inefficient. So try to research on other materials if you're going to buy new materials. And that's the other thing, try to like swap clothes, go to the thrift store, buy vintage, wear older clothes. Like, it's also like a statement, like, I don't care, I'm wearing this, it's old, whatever. Okay.
I have a question. So this is Generation Z, I mean, that's who you're teaching more or less, right? And I'm just curious about their, the idea of supply and demand. So if you starve the demand, right, so if there's Gen Z saying we no longer want to consume these items, then would that in turn affect the supply?
That's somewhere down the line, yeah. But I think there's such an urgency and immediacy. And I think that it's hard to, because we all learn culture, right? And it's hard to, and we reproduce it. And it's hard to navigate beyond that, right? I think because it becomes stigmatized or anything. So like I had this student, I teach a class called archaeology plastics. A student in this class who, like he was a TikTok influencer, he had like 3.9 million followers, because he always did all this advertising on sneakers. And he got all these free sneakers. And at one point in the semester, he would offer lovely, thoughtful discussion points in class on plastics, we're being critical of it. But at one point in the semester, I said to him, like, oh, how do you reconcile what you're putting out there as an influencer on TikTok with this class? And he did not like that. The fact that I was, asking him to think critically about the content that he was creating and the ideas that he was putting out there. And I guess that's what you're supposed to challenge your students. But it really upset him. So I think that most of my students, that critical reflection is hard and challenging. I don't know, with regard to plastics, it's something we never really have to do because it's become so commonsensical to how we live our lives, right? So, I don't know if you guys have tried to eat without plastics for even a day. I make them do a lot, right? If you try to do this exercise where you catalog everything that you use every day, and it's bumpers, it's everything, right? And so for us that's why I think that corporations, they shame you into thinking it's your fault, right? And it's almost impossible, even if we are thinking critically, to get beyond that. So yeah, I'm very hopeful for a lot of my students, but that's also after they've gone through a whole semester with me and I gave their heads instantly.
I like to be a pain in the ass at grocery stores and especially Trader Joe's when they started reintroducing that plastic bag. I'm like, can I talk to your manager? Why are you using plastic bags? Why can't you use paper? I think we just have to all hold everyone trouble because we can't do it in policy, everything. I mean, it's such a huge thing, but you being here and you engaging in this conversation is already part of the solution.
Can I say something to that point? Coming to what you were saying about people in Ecuador throwing the paper of the candy paper on the floor because they didn't knew. I mean, yes, talk to the manager, but don't blame because there is a lot of people that doesn't have the education to understand that that plastic bag is not going to disappear ever or for ages. So I agree on like doing evergreen things, like I'm doing things that you can do, like using recycling, using vintage. And I say what Pamela says, like corporations are the ones that actually could do a change, like pay more money to these people who making people consume to do the reverse, like reuse and recycle and use sustainable materials. So the day that a corporation pays an influencer to say reuse instead of consume, then we'll see a change. But I think we should go for education. And like, yes, I don't use plastic, I for paper, for sustainable materials, what we're buying and thinking what Pamela was saying, what do you use every day? What is it that you're using?
And I think that making things like Pamela's research, like when people really understand, especially this idea you're saying of like the decomposition and the fact that like what a landfill is, you know, not only on a chemical level, but also on a level of world, you know, this idea, I was talking about colonial, like neo-colonialism of the global north, shipping their trash, their shit to Africa, to Latin America, and how that replicates the exact patterns of exploitation from the, you know, it's so crazy, and yet it's happening. So I think education and awareness is
not
key.
imagine, I mean, her student is a master's student, and he's not even thinking critically about like just making people consume on TikTok. It's like, come on, you're in the
Well, I mean, let's start with the fact that like most fashion universities, I mean, word fashion, like I said, there is no critical thought. I taught last semester. My students are like, I would teach them all, they're like, what does this have to do with fashion? I mean, you know, at the end of the day, I turn them all to little activists, but you know, it's true. They're like not thinking critically, and we are in Florida. We're not supposed to think critically here. So, we got that going for us. Go, everyone.
Like, I think people gotta be on a certain like mindset to actually care. Like, if people are struggling on what they're gonna eat, how they're gonna pay their bills, doing all that stuff, they can barely even care about their family, let alone a piece of trash on the floor or making the better decisions. So, I mean, like, it's different ways and different scales to look at stuff, and that's why I think that making people care is where like a lot of attention is spent on marketing and pushing things down people's throats. There could be a different way, I don't know how, but making people care about what's there, making people care about the people that come after them. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm making better decisions with some sort of education, incentives, or reason to do it. To think that somebody that's like getting paid, like as an influencer that just has money coming in, like just by posting, like they don't really care about changing the world because it's going to change their pocket. You feel me? So I think that we have to get creative in different ways. Maybe we can't affect the whole entire world, but we can at least affect in a smaller group. Maybe if we can affect 10 people, get them to think on a certain way, and we might be able to get more people. I'm just stating the obvious in a way, but we kind of forget that sometimes people making a lot of waste, like can barely figure out how to pay their bills, and they got bigger issues on their plate. You know what I'm saying? But you gotta get them to think a little bit beyond like what's right in front of them. If that makes sense.
Okay, go ahead.
I have a question for Veronica. I just was wondering, what are your favorite natural dyes to work with, and are you able to forage any like plants locally around you that you dye with, or do you grow your own in your garden?
Like the answer for what's my favorite dye, it depends where I am. It depends what I can access. You have two dilemmas there, because with natural dyes you need a lot of material, right? And that's one downside about natural dyes, that you need a lot of it to create like a strong color, right? So in that sense, synthetic dyes are more efficient. But what's my favorite that would be cochineal, but cochineal is not local, right? So it depends on what you are, what do you want to do. But here in Miami, I feel there's a lot of things you can explore and you have to observe. Like I see in my backyard, we clean the driveway and immediately it falls a leaf and the leaf stains the driveway. And I'm like, what is it? Or it's just like going out there and like exploring. So depending on what you want to do, you can have a different favorite time. And I do grow indigo in my house.
She does have workshops.
Yeah.
So you should follow her. Guys, I just realized it's 8:30. And we could talk about this forever. I would love to talk about this forever, but I'm sure you have other things to do. Did someone else had a question, right?
It was me.
Yeah.
David, this is for David. David by full time. You biked all over the place. This neighborhood, Marayal, the rich ones, the poor ones, and then you've been around town. Kudos on your biking, your sobriety, and your life, and your treasure. Did you notice, what kind of differences did you notice in the trash that was literally on the street? Did you notice more volume, different things? Were you surprised that, these people in Gables, when they see your trash, too, they're just throwing shit away? Or was it kind of like, did it follow demographics, or how did that go for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like the obvious, like the nicer the area, the less trash that's there. Little Havana has furniture everywhere. Hialeah has trash of all different sizes. I mean, the MacArthur has some interesting stuff always washing up on the side, but like everything, I think that's why doing the stuff that we're doing and we're showing people that there is no shortage. It's kind of like a game of Tetris that always has pieces coming down. So I think the cool thing about the way that we catalog the stuff, we can see which pieces of trash are more popular, hubcaps and it's just really all over the place, and it's kind of weird that we could just hop out, get on a bike, and go anywhere, and we're going to come across something, to a point where I'm being selective as to what pieces to paint, just to kind of not saturate it all, but to keep bringing awareness to it. But yeah, everywhere has trash. Some places a lot more than others. I like sending people into the areas that have a lot of trash where they normally wouldn't go in there. So it kind of brings us all together, of something that we should be trying to get rid of. I don't know if that answered it, but
yeah,
mad trash.
I was just going to say, I could talk about ocean trash because I specialize in that. And of the top 10 items that we find in ocean trash, they are all items from food and beverage consumption, so bottle caps, straws, to-go containers, cups, etc. The top 3 items this past year from the International Coastal Cleanup, which was last week, 2 weeks ago, are microplastics. So that's basically all of the plastics, which is broken down into pieces, the bottle caps, and plastic bottles.
I've seen it.
And cigarette butts.
Yes, those are historically the #1 most littered item in the world, universally. But they've now recently seen a little bit of a switch to the microplastics being more frequent. It could be because people are vaping or smoking less, or it could be because we're consuming more plastic.
And speaking of microplastics, once again, polyester clothing, first 3 washes, that is where the microplastics get thrown into the ocean. When you buy the polyester piece and you wash it, that's when the first 3 washes, that's when most of the microfibers, go out and so on. Anyway, thank you all so much. Thank you. Keep in touch. I'll figure out, I guess if you guys want a green space, maybe I'll pull together some of these resources and put them on a document or something.